you got your quota, you squared away and raced home. And you'd put the big jib on and wholesail and away you'd go. Sometimes if you had the wind dead behind you, you'd bat wing the big jib to make a spinnaker out of it. Sometimes it'd be half a dozen boats racing home through the rip to get home to the pier to throw your fish out.
At Queenscliff, there when the roll comes in, it's not a very good place to lay alongside the pier to put your Couta out. So that, I think that was the start of the racing home, first to home, got the best berth, and you got the facilities to use. Whereas the boats that come in after were waiting, some of them be hanging off head on the outside of the L so that they wouldn't bump their boats waiting to get a berth. And you'd be waiting sometimes an hour or that after you got in if you was late in. So I think that started the race home to see who was the best.
We have two boats that are in hot competition. We've got the Sally and the Surprise. We've got a bit of a luffing duel going on there. The Sally's pushing the Surprise up, trying to make them go underneath.
So I really got to say to you that the Cuda boat ethic is not like a normal sailing club. It's got to do with the passion for timber, the history that goes with Australia's fishing boat heritage, the competitive thrust of boats and people and men, and the good fun that goes with the relaxation in the bar at the end when people talk about what could have been.
Although used largely for catching Couta, they were really a general-purpose fishing boat, used for catching crayfish, snapper, whiting, salmon, and even school and gummy sharks. They were also the general-purpose pleasure boat at all the little fishing ports. They were the runabout, the excursion boat, the fishing party boat, and the pleasure yacht of their day, all rolled into one. From the 1870s, bay steamers ferried passengers from the summer heat of Melbourne for a holiday at the seaside. Queenscliff was the first summer resort at the southern end of the bay, but Portsea and Sorrento, which had previously been lime burners and fishermen's camps, quickly became popular with the well-heeled. Time, a growing population, and notions of progress and public access to the foreshore has seen beachside fishing camps replaced by establishments of fish consumption rather than fish catching. Changes, yes, but not so with the boats themselves. They have returned from what looked like certain extinction in the late 1900s to give pride and pleasure to a younger generation who still experience the timeless joy of the summer holiday by the seaside, messing about in boats. In the days of old, before real estate salesmen replaced fishermen at the seaside towns, city slickers got to rub shoulders with the locals, and some made lifelong friendships. Catering for visitors provided extra income for the fishermen, and a change from the usual routine. This film, shot in 1915, shows Arthur Baillieu with his family and friends embarking on a fishing trip with Mr. Billy Watson of Queenscliff in the 30-foot Victory. Quaintly staged for the camera, the viewer was led to believe that they had enjoyed a successful fishing trip, when in fact they'd only sailed around the end of the pier to land on the other side, brandishing a few Couta. At Port Fairy and Portland, a special Sunday excursion train brought summer visitors from country towns for a day at the seaside. It sometimes took most of the fishing fleet to cater for the influx of visitors, as seen here, when the Terang train arrived at Port Fairy one Sunday in 1908. It was an era with little emphasis on safety, but surprisingly, there appear to have been no tragedies with passengers aboard. There were impromptu races home from the fishing grounds almost daily, but public holidays and special occasions were times for organised regattas. Competition reached its peak in the 1880s and 1890s, when boats sailed for considerable prize money and often a silver cup. In the early 1890s, the Victorian Premier's wife, Charlotte Rickson, was presenting a cup to the winner of the Cuda boat races at Portland. In 1891 and 93, the Rickson Trophy was won by Jim Pill in the Stanley. This regatta was sailed in November 1902 on the occasion of the opening of the Ocean Pier at Portland. Capable fishermen were often sought after as skippers by owners of yachts sailing on Port Phillip Bay. Fishermen often competed in their own boats in yachting events with considerable success. The cliff-type boats, as they were known, became so highly regarded that in 1889 the high-profile businessman of Melbourne and Sydney, Mark Foy, bought the Queenscliff boat Mayflower, renamed her Cananook, and took her to Sydney to compete against the local yachts on the harbour. Her success was not great till Mark Foy sent for Harry Hoppin, a fisherman of Queenscliff, to sail her. There's ample evidence that the Cananook and other Cuda boats subsequently taken to Sydney had an influence on the design of the cruiser and later the Ranger class of yachts sailing on Sydney Harbour. Queenscliff's Mitch Lako was a racing enthusiast whose experience in yacht racing was to bring about changes in the Cuda boat rig. Mitch's son Ken remembers Cuda boat races at Queenscliff in the 1920s.
Every Boxing Day they had a regatta, of course, and that was the main thing. Yeah, I don't know how old I was being on the pier and watching the races, and I've seen them with eight men, big men up on the races and coming in with full sail on, and they were really hanging out. I'm not like they do now, get out of the spray. They were hanging right over the side trying to keep her upright, and I can remember that quite well. It'd probably be at least 16 to 20 boats racing, and they were a real good sight, I can tell you. I can remember when I was a kid going down on the pier and watching it, and there'd be all the crowds down on the pier watching the race. And it always after to be nearly a fight in the pub to see who won when someone did something wrong. I can remember fights outside the pub after they'd had a few in. So that was in a big day for Queenscliff, because I remember, because Mum used to make cakes and things for a party afterwards. When the armistice was signed, I remember they had a big regala day there, and I had a photo once with myself. We had a boat rigged up with peace written on it for to take up in a procession through Queenscliff. And anything like that would, a race or anything like that in those days was considered, you know, something to go and see.
Improvements in road transport in the early 1930s brought about a shift in fishing activity. No longer reliant on the steam train, Lorne and San Remo became popular with Queenscliff fishermen. These ports were not only closer to the fishing grounds, but they had the added advantage that the fishermen did not have to sail through Port Phillip's dreaded Rip. Some fishermen rented rooms in the local boarding houses for the duration of the Couta season, while a few took up permanent residence. By the mid-1930s, San Remo's New Year's Day Regatta was the biggest event on the Couta fishermen's racing calendar. Good prize money was on offer, but far more important was the prestige. By then, in his 70s, Walter Todd, with a lifetime of hard-earned experience behind him, had lost none of his enthusiasm for catching Cuda and winning races against all comers, including two of his sons, Les in the Doreen, or Surprise as she is now, and Sid in the Dawn. Len Bagley remembers the San Remo of the late 1930s, when Walter Todd in the Wattle, a boat Len later owned, was the man to beat.
Well, the Queenscliff fellas used to arrive here in September, early September. They'd bring their moorings with them, there'd be boats all the way up the channel, dump them all over the place. Boats moored everywhere. Flinders blokes used to come as well, and they were good fishermen. They were all good fishermen, good hookers. Because they've worked Queenscliff for years, and this was a pretty easy entrance for them here. They enjoyed working here, I think, because it was so easy getting in and out. I'd have a regatta every year, Couta boat regatta, and that was very popular. It was a big day, a regatta. I remember old Cack Todd was the kingpin of it. He was a real sharp old bloke on the tiller, very clever man at sailing a boat. Another fella, Charlie Newman, he built a boat with white wings to beat old Cack, but he never did. And they used, after the race, Charlie and old Cack would get together and they'd sail the race again, tell each other what mistakes they'd made and all the rest of it. They'd go on for a couple of hours. Yeah, a couple of hours they'd argue the toss, who did this and who did that. But he was a very good sailor, old Cack, very clever. And well, a lot of interest was taken in the race. Quite a big day. Everybody used to turn up to see the race. Yeah.
Harry Muchmore competed in the last fishermen's regattas held at Queenscliff in the late 1940s.
Mine was called the Jessie. She was only 21 feet, and we used to have regattas with, say, 24 feet and under after the war, and I was not skiting at all, but I got beat twice in several regattas that we had. And she could sail, of course I had racing sails made in Geelong at Morwick's, I think his name was. Had a light gauge duck, and sometimes, you know, I'd let Paddy, the brother sailor, and other times if it was blowing pretty fresh, you'd pick up a few students kicking about. Well, I took half a dozen of them aboard, and you could put them to windward to stabilise your boat. And, you know, you have to think of all those things when you're under sail, and not to put too much sail on, otherwise you spill wind out of your sails and they don't sail so fast.
Fishing is as old as the earliest coastal settlements, centring mainly on bay and estuary fishing, using hand lines and nets. The boats were small, few were more than 6 or 7 metres. They were shallow for negotiating sandbanks and mudflats. Freeboard was low for ease of rowing, and they were rigged with a simple lug sail. These boats, sailing at Queenscliff in 1878, are typical of the period. From the earliest times, Cuda were caught when plentiful close inshore, and the fishery slowly developed through the 1860s and 70s, but markets were small and localised. Fish were sailed from Queenscliff to Melbourne, but it was an unreliable form of transport. Fish that could not be marketed fresh were smoked for preservation. Ironically, the Cuda boat probably owes its genesis to the steam train. It was not till the extension of the rail network to Queenscliff, Port Fairy and Portland in the late 1870s and 1880s, giving access to inland towns and the Ballarat and Melbourne fish markets, that fish could be caught and sold in quantity. As a result, a boom took place in the fishing industry, and boats were sought to fish further offshore for Couta. The 1880s was the decade when the Couta boat, as we know it today, really developed, for this was when the pivoting centre plate was introduced. The centre plate gave the boats greater lateral resistance or grip of the water, resulting in far more weatherly craft able to sail to windward. This was a major leap forward in fishing boat technology and a huge benefit to the fishermen. The centre plate was adopted from the centreboard yachts, then sailing on Port Phillip Bay. Smaller, older fishing boats were gradually replaced by deeper centre plate boats up to 30 feet in length. The fleet expanded rapidly through the 1880s. The boats had traditionally been of clinker construction, but in 1885, the first carvel-planked centre plate Couta boat, the General Gordon, was built in Portland by Jacob Pill, who was an emigrant from Cornwall. However, it was a long time before carvel construction completely replaced the traditional clinker planking. The boats of the 1890s and early 1900s were of a moderate draft and wedge-like in cross-section with straight keels. There was a transitory period when a few boats were built which tried to incorporate the advantages of both clinker and carvel construction. They were clinker planked above the waterline, where expansion and contraction of the planking was greatest, and carvel below the waterline, where a smooth surface was an obvious advantage. The 30-foot Wanderer, built by Henry Murray in Melbourne in 1890, appears to have represented a further step in the evolution of the boats. She was a deep-drafted, heavy displacement boat, and was reported by one of the Melbourne dailies as being the first of her type and most seaworthy of the fishing fleet of Portland. The oldest surviving example of one of these large, deep-drafted Couta boats is the Thistle, which was built by John Jones in Melbourne in 1903. Like most boats of a period, she carries a draft well forward, with rather a deep forefoot compared with boats built later. Thistle fished out of Port Fairy for most of her life before undergoing a full restoration at the Wooden Boat Shop in 1988. She's now owned and regularly sailed by the National Maritime Museum at Darling Harbour in Sydney, and is an excellent example of one of the larger Couta boats of the period. The Museum of Victoria has the Patsy, a Jones boat of the 1920s on suspended display in the entrance hall, commemorating the important role these boats played in the state's fishing industry over an extended period. Early in the 20th century, the Couta boats began to standardise at about 26 feet, although there were boats built that were both smaller and larger. The larger boats tended to be involved in crayfishing more than the smaller boats. Small auxiliary engines began to be introduced to the Couta boats through the teen years of the century. Gradually, over the following 20-odd years, sail area was reduced as a result, and hull lines tended to become fuller aft to accommodate the motor. By the end of the 1930s, the day of the classic commercial sailing Couta boat fitted with centre plate when new was about over. There were very few Couta boats built through the war years. The last two fully rigged Couta boats with centre plates were built by Alec Lako and Peter Locke in 1947. However, Couta boats without centre plates continued to be built through the 50s, some with only minor alterations to hull shape. A few have since had centre cases built into them and sail today with the Couta boat fleet. Like his friend Lewis Ferrier, Harry Muchmore has well over a century of fishing tradition behind him. He fished by himself till he was 74. At 82, he still takes a keen interest in what's going on.
It's a kidney colour this morning. We caught Couta here at Queenscliff. We used to sail out, had a motor in the boat of course, but only used the motor when necessary. We used to sail out with a southerly wind, say, or nearly on a wind. There'd be upwards of 40, 50 boats sailing out at the one time. And it was quite a good sight to see. And trolling for Couta, you'd go through a patch of Couta, say 2 mile off Port Phillip Heads, and you'd start catching, and you'd spill the wind out of the sail to slow your vessel down so you wouldn't be going too fast. And you were using bullock hide as lures in those days with number 11-0 hooks, and you had oilskin smocks on with thigh boots, Dunlop thigh boots, rubber, and they kept you nice and warm in those days in the winter time. And anyhow, the oilskins had leather patches sewn under the left arm if you were right-handed, left-handed under the right arm. But anyway, you pulled the Couta in and you threw the Couta under your arm and grabbed him by the back of the neck and unhooked him and just threw him in the boat in the pound where the Couta were until you got your quota. When you got your quota, you squared away, sail, drawing before the wind to come home through the rip. Flood tide, it was nice and easy with the tide. Ebb tide was a bit joggly, but over the years you learn to cope with that. And well, the Couta in those days, perhaps you might have got 5 bob a box. Sometimes that was good money in those days, and sometimes you sent your Couta up, you had to pay the freight to get them to the market because they couldn't sell them. It was very competitive catching Couta here, one against the other. One was better than the other sort of thing. You had a run of good luck, you had a run of bad luck. Sometimes you'd have to lower your lead lines down to bring the Couta to the surface to catch them. But it was fun. It was work, but it was fun.
Since the early 1970s, the schools of barracuda have only appeared at irregular intervals, and the fishery has all but died out. Lewis Ferrier, at the age of 78, is the last active Couta fisherman at Queenscliff. Like the Couta fishermen of old, Lewis is bound by the habits of his prey, rising early to be on the grounds at first light.
What I noticed today, from when I started fishing in early 1938, is the shoreline lights. There might have been 1 or 2 street lights visible at Point Lonsdale, and as far as the navigation aids that we've got aboard every boat today with port and starboard masthead lights and deck lights, well, no light was visible from any fishing boat because they simply didn't have them. Occasionally you'd see the odd fisherman would light up his pipe, a cherry wood pipe, or he'd light up a cigarette, and that light was silhouetted back from the sails that they had set up on their boat when they were going out fishing. And you had a sense of knowing where each boat was, and you knew how far away from them you were. I can remember 51 fishing boats, and 51 fishing boats had sails on. Now a morning like this, we'd be close hauled, maybe with a single reef, because as you got outside the heads, quite often the wind freshened just that little bit more than inside the protectiveness of the bay. But we'd be all sailing along, I'd say 51 of them, and it was a bonza sight to see when the sun rose up. The boats were scattered, from anything from 100 yards from one another to a mile away. One disadvantage of being the last of the fishermen from the port of Queenscliff is that I'm the only boat that's out here. And it's a disadvantage in as much as the more boats, say you had 20 boats and they were about 200 yards apart. Well, that's a big area that they're covering, and you'd expect 20 boats to find the Cuda before one lone fisherman like me coming out here. So it's a big disadvantage of picking up the Cuda quickly. But given time, and I've got plenty of that left.
Although his boat is fitted with a fish finder, Lewis still looks for the signs provided by nature.
The last week or so lately they've been feeding on krill, small blue bait, anchovies, pilchards, small garfish. We keep our eye on the birds. We see them hovering around and we can tell whether it's one of those nuisances of the sea, the seals, if the birds are behaving in a particular manner, we'll go away from him because there's a seal underneath him. But we see the birds congregating on the water and we'll head for them because they're feeding on the same fish as the barracuda. And you can almost guarantee the Cuda won't be far away from that same patch of feed. And up will come the Cuda and they just go berserk. See the size of him? Good Cuda coming in now, look at that one. Just let him know I can hold on to 2 Cuda at a time. I'll never let the knife go, you know. When I started with the old man way back in the early days, the old man used to get the hides from the butchers, the hides for the foreheads of the Hereford cattle actually. The forehead, yeah, or the shins. And they were white, of course. Yeah. And they used to flutter rigged up on your hook. But remember their hair had to run all the one way, that it didn't bubble? Oh, of course. Yep, yep. Yeah. Harry, you know, well, we used to make up the hides with our dads the night before, didn't we? That's right. And soak them in the bucket. Ready for the day. We'd have about 20 of them made up and we'd replace them after a dozen Cuda would bite the hide to pieces. Yes. We used to have to replace them. Well then remember, Harry, when we first started, you started cootering or started fishing about 4 years ahead of me. Oh. I can remember I used to get them between my legs. That's the big Cuda used to jam them between the legs up against the coamons and unhook them. Yeah, well, and then father wouldn't let you wing them because you didn't have the experience. Yeah, well, winging, that was the next thing. When I got a bit older and stronger, we used to throw them under our left arm and hold them firm and hang them like that and take the hook out of them and throw them there. Then quicker than that, though. Yeah. Remember about 1945 and 1948 or so, a bloke come over from Tassie and he had pieces of wattle wood or something. Remember? We laughed at him.
Yeah.
And I think it started at Lawn.
Well, yes.
And
no.
I reckon he would catch 3 Couta to our 1 with the hide against the toggle.
What, with the jig stick?
Yeah, with the
on
jig
end?
stick, because he never handled a Couta, remember?
That's right, yeah.
Now, one of these, Harry, I suppose that'd be one of the last hides on the Victorian coastline, if
Yeah,
anybody
that's
would
right.
remember it.
Yeah.
And then,
Well, a toggle lasts a week,
Then
fortnight, or whatever.
well, I've had that one 12 months, as long as I keep it repainted.
Yeah,
Notice the barber's knocked down?
that's right. Yeah,
We throw it over now, and the fish falls off, and you throw it straight out again.
Exactly.
Our times have changed, Harry,
Oh,
but the
well,
prices haven't.
At speed, while the Couta are biting, you go as fast as you can.
Hey, we could talk for hours on what used to be to what it is.
I know.
Remember how Dad or our eldest brother or another fisherman that might have been in? Now make sure the hide is following the hook like that. Remember how you used to have to throw it straight out like that?
Oh, yeah.
Remember how they used to curse you if you dropped it back like a handy-pandy Sheila aboard the boat? Throw the bloody thing out. Right away threw it in. And you know, as soon as it hit the water, Couta was on. Well, we'd pull in as hard as we could, and we'd have the Couta on the end of the line. We'd lift our arm up and throw him under, hold him like that, grab him under the jaws and fiddle around with the hook to get it out of his jaw like that. And then we'd throw it, the Couta, into the boat and throw the line out again. And we kept on. I reckon we caught a Couta every 4 seconds.
Oh, pretty fast.
But remember the ticklers, Harry, the ticklers just
the
behind.
chain,
Yeah, didn't they catch Couta in the dark?
Well, you didn't have to look at your hook and board. You could backhand them over the back of you when they were biting. Been a good life, the fishing. You were born to it as a boy, and you liked it. Well, fair enough. You had fun, and it was very competitive. It's treated me okay. I'm quite happy about the life. I'd do it over again.
As the 3 older Couta ports of Queenscliff, Port Fairy and Portland were established long before the advent of motor transport, the fishermen lived within easy walking distance of the wharf. At Queenscliff, the fishermen's precinct was known as the Flats, which was an area of low land close to the beach, specifically set aside for the fishermen to establish their homes.
It's the Fisherman's Flats, it's called here where we live. And it's sort of a part of Queenscliff, and yet it's not a part of Queenscliff because we were looked down on for years by the people in the top end of the town of Queenscliff, only because you're fishermen and labourers, I suppose. And anyway, we even used to play football against the tops, the fishermen lads. And we used to play in the park over here, Victoria Park, and you'd put your coats down to mark as the goals and things like that. The women that they used to hang over the front gate all the time, and everybody knew what the neighbours were doing or those down the street, and all the gossip used to go on with the women, but there again, they used to help each other a lot too. If you had trouble, sickness, whatever, they used to hop in and help you, the women folk. And that was like the women, they were good women, you know. There was not like today. You got married and you had your wife for life.
Stan Evans grew up in the Port Fairy fishing community in the 1920s and 30s. His family had been fishermen since the 1860s. Most fishing families live near the river, in Gipps and Wishart streets. Stan remembers the wharf as an unofficial meeting place.
I suppose you could say that the wharf really was a social club for the fishermen because, my father used to say, I'll go for a walk down to the wharf and see who I can see down there. And of course they were always down here for maintenance and things like that. And so a few of them would get together and they'd pull up 3 or 4 fish boxes in a circle and sit around and talk about all sorts of things. We kids, of course, were never allowed to join the circle. We were never allowed to say anything, but we were allowed to pull up our own fish boxes behind the circle and sit there and listen. So they'd talk about anything, but one of the subjects that always got an airing was the dirty middlemen in the Melbourne fish market, who they hated with a passion because they didn't understand really the marketing system, and they thought they were being taken for a ride, and indeed they were for a lot of the time. All sorts of things were pulled against the fishermen in those days. Fish would get iced and you'd never hear of them anymore. They'd give you the lowest price when in fact they'd sold the fish for the highest price. And so they had plenty to complain about, and they certainly did complain about it. And they'd talk about who won the race on the way in and how well Joe sailed his boat because it was Joe talking. And they talk about all the gossip of the place. They really gossiped, I suppose, but it was their meeting place, and if it was wet, they'd get into the round top shed and they'd play poker for matches, and they really enjoyed themselves, but it was a sort of shifting population, if you like, because someone would say, well, I've got to do something, and he'd go and someone else would come along and join it. But you always knew that if you came down to the wharf, you could find someone to talk to. And the fishermen deliberately used that as in effect a social club, I've always thought, as much as the other clubs that they belonged to, like the bowling club and things like that.
Portland is a deep water port, which has had a flourishing fishing and boat building industry from the earliest times. The most prominent fishing family in the 1800s were the Dustings, who emigrated from Cornwall in 1856 and, not surprisingly, brought their fishing technology with them. The craypots used in Portland up till the 1930s were identical to those used in Cornwall during the same period. In Portland, most fishermen lived in the south of the town, in and around Barclay Street. John Seeley grew up in the area during the 1940s and went fishing in 1950.
I was brought up in Barclay Street. There was quite a few fishermen lived up in South Portland, in the Barclay Street, Bancroft Street area. There wasn't much money about those days. You used to get about 10 shillings a dozen for flathead, rock cod. Used to go out and handline those out in the bay. And crayfish were very cheap. Barracuda were very cheap also. Most of the fishing equipment was carted around on push bikes, and even in later years Jack Arkle was still going, and you'd see him riding down the wharf from up in Finley Street with a craypot on his shoulders, on his back, on the push bike. I can remember we used to have to thread the flathead and rock cod on wire, and then you'd hang it on the handlebars of the bike to deliver it to Tom, or he'd come down and put them in his barrow and take them up the street to sell them. And he'd stand on the corner. He had a very loud voice, and he'd just yell out fresh fish, barracuda and so forth, and just sell them out of the barra.
It's not clear whether fishermen were harder drinkers than the rest of the community, or simply more visible as a group, but they did have a reputation.
Dad, he used to like his grog a little bit, you know, and most of the fishermen did in those days. They'd actually stop of a Friday fishing and get dolled up in their creams and jackets and things like that and go up to the pub, the Esplanade, and anyway, sometimes you'd go looking for the old man, as Dad, I should call him, and anyway, you'd find a lot of them asleep in the running track over in the park after getting all dolled up and all that sort of thing, you know, having a day off. And you'd find the old man and you'd wake him up in the running track and take him home for tea. I remember going up with Mum to look for him at one particular spot at a time, and he was with old Cocky Shafter coming home, and we were coming round Duggar Warren's corner there into Bridge Street, and him and Cocky were arguing, you know, half-tanked of course, and it actually come to fisticuffs, and the old man let one go and he flattened old Cocky. And old Cocky was about 6'6", you know, big man, and that's the way the fishermen used to sort of act up, having a few sherbets at the pub, and of course that carried on into the younger fellas when they grew up. Being 21, you know, you're a man then, in those days.
Hard drinking and hard playing as many of the fishermen may have been, the vast majority were nevertheless hard-working, independent, resourceful and brave in times of disaster. Weather was a far greater factor in the reckoning of the fishermen in the days of sail than it is to fishermen of today. A sail ripped in a gust of wind could mean the difference between life and death. Drownings were not uncommon. It was an era of no social security. Small boats were uninsurable. Loss of a boat usually resulted in considerable hardship for the family. Widows had to fall back on the generosity of friends and family, take in washing, or find another husband. For the Queenscliff fishermen, the greatest problem were the strong tides which raced through the narrow entrance to Port Phillip Bay, which is known as the Rip. When the outflowing tide, known as the ebb, meets the incoming seas, very steep and breaking waves are created, easily capable of overwhelming small craft. Conditions at the Rip sometimes deteriorated while the men were out fishing. Lives were sometimes lost, and many had bad frights.
Yeah, well, I got caught in the Rip once. Shocker. With the ebb tide running against the ocean roll, the sea stands up enormous. And of course, the boat wants to go down the face of the sea until it gets to the bottom of the sea and it hits the blooming tide that's flowing back the other way. And if you don't keep the boat square onto the sea, it'll swirl round on you and just roll over. And of course, the Lucy L was such a wonderful seaboat, and it used to run like a surf boat. And she held her head high because she had the weight of fish aft. And it would be hard to imagine how tall the seas were, but when you got down the trough, you couldn't see over the top of them. They were that steep, and it was like as if you was down in a hole. I got caught, I couldn't go back against the sea was enormous. So I kept going, and I had the sails up, and the boat was tearing down the face of the sea, and the sails were coming inboard, and then with the draft, and then the boat had stopped and it lay back on the sea, and the next one had rolled behind me, and the way the thing had gone, I thought, oh geez, this is it. I'm not going to get out of this one. And I got over the edge of a tide swirl. There was a great big tide swirl in the middle of the rip, and it was like a big smooth patch in the middle of it, and I'd got across that, and I was just outside the breakers. The breakers were breaking behind me. What used to happen was, when for a week or so, every night, as soon as I'd go to sleep, the sea used to pour over the end of the bed. Frightened the daylights out of me.
Till the cutting was put through to Swan Bay in 1936, the Queenscliff fishing fleet moored between the piers in front of the town, where they were exposed to southeasterly gales. The worst damage to boats occurred in the Great Gale of November 1934. Port Fairy was known as a safe river port, but occasionally boats have foundered and lives lost when entering the river in southeast gales. The worst disaster came in the form of an exceptional flood in 1946, which destroyed the wharf and wrecked 5 boats. In the early days at Portland, the fishing fleet lay to swing moorings in a bay open to the southeast. In the event of an impending gale, smaller boats had to be run up on the beach or winched onto the jetty. Several times, almost the entire fleet was destroyed, and the beach littered with wreckage from end to end. A breakwater was built in 1890, but even then the boats were not immune from harm in the worst of gales. The spars protruding from the water in this photo are the masts of boats sunk in the gale of June 1923. In a case of shipping disasters, lifeboats were stationed at most ports along the coast. These were mostly manned by fishermen who risked their own lives to save others. The service was begun in 1857, using self-righting and self-draining lifeboats designed in England and built in Williamstown. Queenscliff was to have the only motorised lifeboat, which was commissioned in 1926. This boat was kept ready with a trained volunteer crew till 1979. By this time, improved technology had greatly reduced the number of disasters, just as it had rendered the 1926 lifeboat technology obsolete. The sea has not changed, but thanks to modern technology, it's become a much safer place on which to work.
I went over to San Remo last February and saw 60 boats sailing, and I tell you what, it did something to me when I saw those 60 boats going and realised what it had become. You can't tell me you can't grow old and not feel a bit of pride at seeing them.